So as mentioned by Laura, this is I'm going to present the results of a broad review of goals, elements, criteria, and indicators on ILM. And this review was conducted by multiple authors. As you can see there's a long list of authors in this working paper that we are preparing to publish. So I'm gonna be presenting the results on behalf of the authors. Next slide, please. So as mentioned by Khalil, our motivation and purpose of the review was driven by the fact that ILM is a complex concept. Next slide, please, Laura. And which has been the focus of research and global reviews in recent years. And as mentioned again by Khalil, Sarah Sher noted that more than 70 different names have been used to refer to some form of landscape approaches, while the practical applications of ILM have resulted in varying success. So we were interested in finding answers to two critical questions. How will an ILM framework be applied across diverse contexts to encourage implementation and scaling? And within that framework, what criteria and indicators are generally applicable to monitor and measure success across such diverse landscapes? And finally, the review was aimed to glean insights for guidance to implementation, and as well as the development of tools, criteria, and indicators for the 22 LFF projects. Conversely, also, the LFF projects can provide enormous opportunity to explore valuable insights into remaining knowledge gaps in the literature, which might be useful for other ILM projects across the globe. Next slide, please. So we conducted a systematic review following the procedures of Pauline and Stewart, and did the searches in July and December 2020, and additional search was done in 2022. So as you can see here, this is the table showing the expanse of our broad review. Key authors that are familiar to you, I'm sure, are there, covering studies, reviews, and synthesis of cases from Africa, Asia, America, and Europe. Okay, next slide, please. So from the review of global synthesis and studies of cases, we found that there are 4 to 5 ILM goals. The first is production, which is about sustainable production of crops, livestock, fish, forest, and wild edible resources and their value chains. The conservation, restoration, and enhancement of biodiversity and ecosystem services. The livelihoods and human well-being, including health, social relations, security, freedom of choice, and others. Institutions and governance. Institutions that support the integration of landscape goals and effective governance that enables participation in planning and decision-making in landscape processes. And more recently, climate resilience has been added to ILM goals, seeing that enhancing the capacity of production, conservation, livelihood, and governance systems in the landscape is important to withstand climate-related threats, stresses, and shocks. Next slide, please. Then the big question is how to achieve these multiple goals. The key is really to reconcile these multiple goals and manage trade-offs. As we all know, goals are not of equal importance to different types of stakeholders and could change along the way. So there is no such static goal. But these goals are starting points for stakeholder deliberation and decision-making. And also, it is not realistic to have all stakeholders agree with all the landscape goals, yet they can share a goal or decide and agree to develop a common vision, which is basically moving towards achieving landscape multifunctionality. The concept of landscape multifunctionality is very important to ILM because it is the desired landscape condition representing the coexistence of functions that help achieve economic, environmental, and social objectives through spatial integration of land uses and activities. Next, please. More recently, also, there are new ideas that pop up around our work in ILM. Next slide, please. So lately, the theory of change and theory of place emerge in ILM planning and practice. On the one hand, local people and institutions who are the direct stakeholders in landscapes have their own histories, identities, needs, and interests that make up the landscape's theory of place. On the other hand, the theory of change builds causal sequences of stakeholder actions towards a desired change. And to increase the success of applying TOC, it is important for this TOC to be firmly based on a theory of place that considers all major landscape assets and early involvement of all stakeholders. Next slide, please. So based on the review, as you can see, pardon that this is a very big table here. So based on our review, we summarize the principles, elements, and various aspects of ILM from the studies of various authors, as you can see there. And if you go across from left to right in the different columns, you will notice, you will easily identify that there are commonalities across the results of the different studies conducted by these different authors. So from that, we summarized from this long list. Next slide, please. From this long list of elements, principles, or aspects of ILM, we synthesize them into three fundamental elements, which are scale and integration, stakeholders, and governance. Next slide, please. And I'm going to talk each one of them in the coming slides. So first, on scale and integration. Scale, the size, or the space, or the boundary in landscape is very significant to ILM as it indicates the level of complexity and integration required to manage the landscape. In integration, there is such a thing as horizontal integration, which helps to minimize the trade-offs of different stakeholders, sectors, and objectives, and is really key to achieving multifunctionality. Multifunctionality in the first place ought to be constructed by different stakeholders. And to integrate different stakeholders, they need to be carefully identified to ensure that no one is underrepresented and are actively engaged in all stages of the ILI, the Integrated Landscape Initiative. Vertical integration is also important because it helps to address the complexity of the landscape and the communities living in those landscapes. So regardless of size, landscapes can be connected or integrated through vertical structures at multiple scales. That's local, regional, or international, depending on the issues being addressed or the level of desired change in that landscape. There's also a time dimension in integration. The time dimension implies that integration takes time, and achieving landscape goal is a long process, a long-term process requiring inclusive stakeholder consultation and well-informed decision-making. Next slide, please. Now we talk about stakeholders. Different stakeholders in the landscape have their own perspectives, interests, expectations, and positions in society or in the landscape, which they use to justify their actions and as well as their decisions. So they need to be carefully identified, they need to be engaged, their capacities needs to be developed or enhanced, and there should be a shared vision and motivation amongst the stakeholders. So helping the stakeholders understand different scenarios and their trade-offs associated with each of the goals can help them set the right goals and share a vision. And there are many tools around that to help stakeholders understand the trade-offs of their decisions. Some of them are very common to all of us, like net mapping, stakeholder mapping, and analysis matrix. And these are, I think that our next speakers will be tackling some of this. Next, management and governance. So continual learning and adaptive management is fundamental because landscape goals change over time. Please go back up. Go back up. So for management and governance, yes, continual learning and adaptive management is fundamental because landscape goals change over time. Agreements on a common vision are just a starting point, yet they should be open to periodic reflection and refinement. Transparency is also important because it helps reduce conflict, reach consensus about the shared vision, and build stakeholder trust. Effective management, monitoring, and evaluation is also important because it identifies successful and unsuccessful areas of ILM, help to identify also the remaining problems as well as opportunities valuable for continual learning among stakeholders. Likewise, strong institutions are needed to foster success through the availability of supporting policies, frameworks, and arrangements. And finally, effective management that focuses on fostering the links between landscape elements and address issues from both inside and outside of the landscape. Next slide, please. So from summarizing this elements, principles, or aspects of ILM, we summarize them into guide questions that might help our ILM planners or implementers as they move towards achieving their goals. So there are questions around scale and integration, around stakeholders and management, and as well as governance, which I don't think I have enough time to go through each and every one of them. But the key is that these are questions around these main elements would help us better understand how we are doing with ILM and whether we are going to achieve our, intended vision and objectives in the landscape. Next slide, please. So part of the problem with ILM, despite setting aside the issue of multiple approaches as well as different interpretations of landscape approaches, there is a lack of performance metrics in ILM. So in our review, we found that there's a gap in the understanding of the causal relationship between interventions and the effectiveness of ILIs. There's also a very scant studies that quantitatively link interventions with outcomes, and this is partly due to lack of guidelines for data collection, monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. And most of all, there's lack of metrics and guidelines to assess ILI performance. If they are available, these performance metrics often exist in form of project level reporting or a focus on certain aspects, for example, on conservation only, and they struggle to combine an assessment of the different elements in the landscape. Now, next slide, please. So what do we really need to measure in the landscape? So the criteria and indicators for ILI or Integrated Landscape Initiative performance should be derived from the goals. From the goals, it can be all of the 5 goals or depending on what the stakeholders agree to achieve, on what objectives or what goals they would like to focus on. So there are many authors suggested 2 levels of measurement in ILM. First is the project level, which is a very straightforward approach, which informs us about effectiveness and shows the relationships between interventions and its effects, while the landscape level reveals the status, outcomes, and complicated processes relating to the shared vision. So in assessing ILM performance, it is really important to distinguish and consider measures at both the project and the landscape level, since their roles and capabilities in revealing the performance of ILM are different. Next slide, please. So criteria. So criteria is derived from the goals that characterize the key components of the ILI. So it is actually desirable endpoints of the goals. While indicators are, of course, as we know, relevant, precise, sensitive, measurable, and easy to understand, and they can range from very broad to very specific indicators. On this slide, you can see we have a checklist for selecting indicators that might help our colleagues, ILM practitioners, when they are developing their CNI. So For instance, indicators should be developed early in the development of ILIs, in the early stage, and local people and experts need to participate and contribute to developing the indicators. This is really very important. After all, we are measuring and evaluating and monitoring the performance of the goals that were being set by the stakeholders. Next slide, please. So from our review, as I mentioned, there were 5 goals we found. And if we get a summary of this goals and criteria and indicators, we identified 15 criteria and 63 indicators. So as you can see here, for goal number 1, which is on production, we have 4 criteria. One is on production resources, on yield and productivity, on the impacts of production on wild biodiversity and ecosystem services, and the support response to economic, anthropogenic, and natural disturbances. So I think the indicators are quite straightforward, but again, these are suggested indicators from the literature review that are, of course, subject to refinement deliberation by the stakeholders in the landscape. Next slide, please. The second goal is on biodiversity and ecosystem conservation. There are 4 indicators as well. One is maintaining the intactness of natural and semi-natural areas, conserving native biodiversity, restoring degraded natural ecosystems, and increased investment in biodiversity conservation. And there are a number of indicators corresponding to this of the criteria. Next slide, please. The third is on livelihood and human well-being, where we have 3 criteria. One is on meeting livelihood demands and well-being of all social groups while sustaining natural resources. Next is increasing household and community assets. And the third is local economies and livelihoods are resilient to changes in human and non-human population dynamics. And we have indicators like employment, generating and increasing income, food security, clean water, energy, shelter, market and credit access, rights to equitable access of local resources, capacity building, sound public health, and reduced social conflicts, as well as incentives created. Next slide, please. The fourth goal, strong institution and effective governance, has 3 criteria: policies, mechanisms, and institutions, norms, governance structures supporting ILM. Second is inclusive decision-making. Third is needed support in place. So again, the indicators are quite straightforward. You will have policies, institutional mechanisms, agreements supporting ILM, respect, recognition, and integration of indigenous knowledge, norms, values, and customs, which is very important, as this is part of the theory of place in a landscape. And of course, building effective governance structure, participation, voice and decision-making, clarity and transparency, platforms for dialogues, the multi-stakeholder platforms, land use planning, and supporting organizations that provide services or expertise to the landscape. Next slide, please. Last but not the least, we have goal 5, climate resilience, and climate change. The criteria is climate change adaptation and mitigation. And there are 9 indicators identified. Some of these are actually very much linked to the previous goals. So this is something that can be modeled through by the stakeholders when deciding which indicators to adapt in their given landscapes. Next slide, please. So in total, we have 5 goals, 15 criteria, and 63 indicators. The slide you are seeing here are some of the resources that we reviewed for criteria and indicators. And as you can see, number 1 is Louise Buck there, and I'm sure she will talk some of this in her discussion later. Next slide. Finally, some remarks. integration is a key task in ILM. Without integration, there is no ILM. So I think it's very basic. No? Second is that multifunctionality is also key in ILM. It is the coexistence of multiple functions that serve the economy, society, and nature, and should be the shared vision in the landscape. So achieving multifunctionality ought to be the shared vision of stakeholders in the landscape, so that no one is left behind, and every actions and decisions serve the purpose of the economy, society, and nature. All ILIs involve some degree of integration of stakeholders, sectors, institutions, and motivations. And we found that strong ILIs are associated with the best integration of stakeholders and sectors in combination with effective institutions and investments to resolve landscape. The guide questions serve as a checklist for designing and implementing ILI, while the CNI serves as a framework for what to monitor and to measure in the landscape. And finally, based on the intention of this review, our interest lies in the application of the guide questions and the initial set of CNI to help the 22 LFF projects. With that, I end my presentation. Thank you very much.